And
Okay. Well, it was really a hard task. I had to just drop a note to Larry and he immediately responded. I was thrilled. Thank you, Larry, for your willingness. And thank all of you for joining us today. But I'm going to just turn it over to you, Larry, and let you take it. We don't want to take any of your time.
Okay. Thank you, David. Let me say at the outset how grateful I am to have this opportunity and to see each of you. I don't know how many of you have attended the seminary friends meetings at Berea and elsewhere through the years, but one of the great aspects of those meetings was swapping tales and telling stories about our experience at Southern Seminary, and I hope this will have some of that flavor. Those are good memories for me. I'm going to talk briefly. I told Sue I had limited myself to 20 minutes, and she says that's way too long. But I promise not to go past that, and I'm going to set a time. Well, I'm not going to set a timer. One of you kind of watch and let me know when I've got 5 minutes left, so I won't over speak here. I want to start with a quote from the last chapter of the book by George Orwell. Writing a book is a horrible, exhausting struggle, like a long bout of some painful illness. One would never undertake such a thing if one were not driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand. I pretty much feel that about this book. So I want to begin by saying, or trying to answer the question, why did I write this book in the first place? I've got several reasons why. The first is within our family, as our children grew up, and even in my family of origin, there was not a lot of conversation about family stories and background and so forth. So our children, Laura and Mike, didn't grow up listening to a lot of stories about our childhood and backgrounds and so forth. And a few years ago, Laura asked me to write some of those experiences down so she would know about them. And so I started there. The second reason is that I needed to clean out my attic. I'm one of those that believes you shouldn't leave a pile of junk for your children to have to get rid of. So I had an attic of accumulated reports and calendars and writings. And during COVID, I had time to start sorting through some of that. I'd been encouraged to create some boxes of archives for the Baptist collection at Mercer University. And so I started doing that. And as I tried to assemble and organize that material, I realized how much of the material related to the SBC controversy. And I wanted to try to document 30 years later the impact that had on Southern Seminary and Southern Baptist Convention. Also, Andy Rawls generously created for me a collection of copies, electronic copies of the tie back in 2005 when we put together the Honeycutt Review and Expositor publication, and I still had those. So I had some sources for dates and events and so forth. The third reason is that I continue to be concerned about Baptist options for theological education. I wanted to document something of the impact the Holy War had on them. And initially, I was going to have a whole chapter on the impact on theological education. And it was just getting too long, and I was running out of energy to do that. So I didn't get to give as much focus to that as I want. I do have some material that alarms me. To be a professor at some of the 6 SBC seminaries today, you have to put your signature on 6 different creedal documents. And I don't know how you do that when they don't all necessarily agree with one another, but that's reality. And finally, I just needed some time, something to do with my time. COVID, we couldn't take many trips, couldn't go many places, couldn't do much outside work. So I decided that I would change my oath never to write another book after the one I wrote on leadership in 2013 and start this one. And finally, after reading Gregory Will's book on the history of Southern Seminary, could I see a show of hands? How many of you have read that book? Any of you? I know some of you have. Well, it's a great history in some respects, but after reading it, and I'm only going to use one bad word here, I was pissed off. I was angry about it. And the reason I was angry was that it told all the stories of controversy, but none of the stories of great accomplishment. And in particular, gave very little attention to the faculty that I knew and had experienced, had learned from, with a few exceptions. And the exceptions were always a controversy, like Bill Hull's article on, shall we call the Bible infallible? And Wills suggests that was one of the main catalysts for the controversy, which I don't subscribe to. And as I looked at the previous, by the way, I have Alzheimer's when it comes to names, so I may have to get some help for a name. The previous 1958 edition.
Mueller.
Huh?
Mueller.
The Mueller publication had a collection of all of the faculty members who had taught at Southern Seminary. And so I spent more energy than any other single thing compiling Appendix A. I'm sure there's a few errors in it, and I want to thank Bob Johnson for helping get me some help from the archives at Southern, and I had a very cooperative relationship with the staff there to try to compile that. Now, with apologies to Paul Richardson and others of you who didn't do theology degrees, I focused it only on the School of Theology because they were the culprits that created the controversy, not the folks in church music and Christian education, though they were wonderful colleagues and wonderful contributors to the institution at that time. And both of them have been eliminated as schools, as has the social work school. So those are the reasons. I still turn to Appendix A every now and then to find out who came when and when they left and so forth. And I hope that's a helpful mark for each of you. Now, the second thing I'd like to talk about is what looks different today as an understanding of what happened in the 1980s in the SBC. If you I have not read every book written on the controversy, I assure you. I think I've read the most important ones and the main ones, but we know a lot of what was happening in the 80s now that we had no knowledge of in the 1980s as it was happening. I don't claim to be a certified historian with in-depth research of all these, but think about the significant recent material related to the issue of feminism. If any of you are really interested in a fabulous book, read the Barr book on the history of the role of women in the church. It's an excellent resource. The other major one that I found so helpful is the book on Jesus and John Wayne. It's a study of evangelical organizations and their emphases and their patriarchalism and so forth. So those are exciting resources. The other aspect that is knowledge about the organizations and the influence of right-wing organizations during the controversy. One of those was the Council for National Policy. The Council for National Policy is a collection of the richest families of Republicans in the country. If I remember correctly, and I note a book on it in the bibliography, it costs $200,000 to join as a member of the Council for National Policy. Now, I know how our good friend Paul Pressler paid that bill. Paul Pressler was an exceptionally rich man. On the moderate side, John Balla, the CEO of Cisco, and his family now funds most moderate causes in some way. John Ball once told a friend of mine that Paul Pressler's wealth made him look small. I can't document that for sure, but he came from a very wealthy family. He married a woman from a very wealthy family. And I haven't understood how I don't have any problem how he's joined. I don't understand how Paige Patterson came up with that kind of money, or Richard Land. And I suspect both of them got paid for by Paul Pressler. And finally, and then I'm going to wrap this up and we're going to have discussion. There was the lingering issue of race within the denomination. I've not given enough attention in the book to the impact of the actions taken in 1971 by Richard Nixon when he was president of eliminating the tax exemptions for segregated colleges and high schools in the South. And you may be familiar with the Supreme Court decision that upheld that action when the IRS taxed the right-wing school in Chattanooga. What's that fundamentalist school in Chattanooga?
Tennessee Temple.
Yes, Tennessee Temple. No, it's not that one. It's the other one. Anyway, the Southern Baptist Convention had fights over resolutions calling for the overthrow of that law. And one book that's not in the bibliography, I just recently became aware of, though I've known of him for a long time, Randall Balmer, a strong evangelical, progressive evangelical, has written a book called Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. So any of you interested in that, I haven't read the book. I've read a little bit about it. I know Randall and have had some communications with him, but I wish I had had that book previously. Now, that's about all I want to say as an introduction, and I hope we can have widespread conversation together and interact with each other and share what you would like to say. Now, I have a question. David, do you want to moderate this conversation? Andy, do you want to moderate it? You want me to moderate it? How should we proceed here?
David, why don't you do it as long as you can be here?
Okay, or Larry, you may actually do better responding to all of those, but.
Well, okay, we'll try it that way. Can you make me little and everybody else big? Or where we can kind of see each other?
You can change the view to gallery on your computer and you can see who's talking. Everyone is muted, so if you want to speak, just unmute yourself and address Larry.
Okay, let's start. I'm going to start with one that's already been raised. George Bullard went flying with me from Glorieta or Santa Fe to Albuquerque, and he raised a question I hadn't raised. Was anybody else in the room ever brave enough to get in an airplane with me? I was a pilot for a few years, and the truth of the matter is, there is at least one other person in this group that flew with me on one occasion. And I'm going to ask him to give a very brief, that'll be hard for him to do, but a very brief summary. Floyd Roebuck and I took a flight, and tell us about it, Floyd.
Glad to do that, but I touched something a while ago and I've lost all of you, and I got a thing on my screen that says Zoom and none of your pictures anymore. So I'll figure that out in a minute. Yes, I have been on an airplane with you. He would want the short version, so here it is. There was a meeting going to occur down in South Georgia, and Larry needed to be there, and I was going to be there. I'm not sure what it was about. It was at Statesboro, I think, but that may have been when I was chair of the board at Shorten. It was probably some meeting having to do with the presidents and the chairman of the boards. But we were going to go and we were going to fly down, and I was going to fly with Larry. But the day came, and here we are out at Russell Field, which is the local airport, and getting ready to get on board. But there's one little bit of problem. The ceiling that day was about 600 feet. There was nothing beyond it except clouds. But we bravely, I'm foolishly, get on board with Larry, and we take off. And at about 600 feet, we leave the earth into the cloud, and I did not see the ground again for 2 or 3 hours. We fly out of Rome. Larry gets with the Atlanta Tower, and they give him direction, and he does what they tell him to do. And after Atlanta, we go toward Macon, and we're following the Macon Tower. We still don't see anything. Actually, by this time, we were above the clouds, and I look down on the outside, and all I see is the top side of clouds. no physical landmark. There is no evidence that there is a world or an earth below. After Macon, we start again on toward our ultimate destination, and eventually Larry is getting his final instruction, and we're getting close to our destination, but we're still above it. I haven't seen the ground now for a long time, and I began to wonder, if we're going to land at this place, is there a radio antenna out here where it's sticking up that we're going to see and hit? We won't see it, we'll hit it. Anyway, I'm listening to the conversation between Larry and the tower, and the guy from control says, you ought to be headed right now toward the airport. And so we begin our descent, and at about 600 feet, we drop out of the clouds, and all of a sudden, what I first see is the airport. We're headed straight toward it. And the second thing I observed when I'm beginning to be aware of my surroundings is that we're headed in the middle of the runway on which we're supposed to land. And Larry just simply lets us fall on down to the runway and gently puts the airplane down. A perfect reading of his instruments, and puts us exactly on the ground quite safely. So yeah, that was my ride. I don't know that I should have taken it, but I did, and I enjoyed it later. I don't know that I enjoyed it a whole lot. So anyway, and what I learned yesterday, it would have frightened me even more if I had known it then, that I had started learning to fly 2 years before Larry had, and I had no capability with instruments. I'd never taken any instrument training. Mine was all visual flight rules. So anyway, here he was, and he took us on a great trip. And quite honestly,
Well, we lost you, Floyd. With that, we better go to some other questions. One of the things I've realized in this book is the number of people.
$12, I think, or something.
Thanks, Floyd. You make me feel proud that we're both still alive.
It was a pleasant flight. Being with Larry McSwain is always pleasant. And since I have the thing, I want to warn any of you who have not yet read the book. It's going to cost you, in the sense of it's already cost me some hours of sleep. My book was delivered on Tuesday afternoon late, and I was just going to read it, speed read it through, glimpse, so I could talk intelligently today, if that was possible. And frankly, it is so beautifully written and so chock full of detail that wasn't possible. So I went to bed Tuesday night a good bit later than I normally would have, and I did again last night so that I could actually read the book. It is an outstanding production, and it is something that was needed. And Larry's discussion and documentation of what went on before most of us even knew there was a war. It is outstanding.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off, Floyd, now. I want you to put that on Amazon.com so I can sell some books.
I want to be sure that everybody understands it's worth the read, it's worth the time it takes, and it is something that was desperately needed. Now, that's all I have to say about it. Okay.
Thank you very much. One of the reactions that has surprised me has been the number of people who have sent me emails, and the response has been, I began reviewing my own experience at Southern and talk about that. So let's talk about your experiences. What decade were you at Southern? What did you find most helpful?
Well, Larry, I was up there when you were there. You was my professor in a D-Min program. I'm Dewey Mayfield. You heard what I said?
Who's talk? Oh, well, there you are. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dewey.
Well, I'd just say that I enjoyed you. Louis Drummond was there. He was a friend too from Alabama.
Yeah.
And I guess I was a little older than some of the students up there, but this was my midlife crisis that I was in when I went to Southern. I went to New Orleans, Howard College, New Orleans. I believe Floyd Roebuck was at Howard College when I was there.
Okay, thank you, Dewey. Who else?
I was there 58 to 61. And so it was before the big crisis, sort of in between after the firing of the professors and before the change in the denomination. But I really appreciate the book. Sorry to be late, but I had a doctor's appointment and just got back. So, but I've really enjoyed the book. It brought back a lot of memories. And I was in Alabama during a lot of the initial changes in various churches there. And then I was at the 1985 convention in Dallas, and they commandeered the main hall with the pro-Fundy crowd, and we were way back in one of the other rooms. It was disturbing to, when they take a vote, they'd count the votes in the, you may have already covered this, but they counted the votes in the main hall first, and you could hear the cheers go up before they counted our votes. It's looking back on it, it's kind of an ironic situation. But one of the questions is,
was that, George?
85
Yeah, okay.
in Dallas, 45,000 people there. Is that pretty accurate description? You were there, I'm sure.
One thing I would like to add, among the deficiencies I felt about the will history, there's one short paragraph about the deanship of Penrose Santamont. Penrose Santamont was a key leader during your time, George, or at least as you left, he made a big difference in the transition out of 1958 and the chaos of that event to a new direction and a positive direction. And his contribution to Southern Seminary, in my mind, was phenomenal. Wallace and I were in a seminar together with Penrose in his office that I remember. And Wallace, you had read who's the woman, Southern writer from Georgia here.
Flannery O'Connor.
You knew
Flannery O'Connor.
huh?
Yeah. Flannery O'Connor.
Flannery O'Connor,
Yeah. And
we had a great time in that seminar.
that was a great seminar. He let me in. I was finishing up my MDiv. I had just completed a master's degree in literature at UK and had taught a couple of years there and a couple of years at U of L. And so I've always thought that due to the influence of John Killinger on my life at Georgetown, that reading literature and understanding it would be a great help for communication and aiding sermonizing. So I enjoyed that kind of reading and teaching. And anyway, it was a quote that Thomas Merton said that she was one of the finest Christian writers he had ever seen. And that pleased Penrose. Yeah.
Who else wants to testify? This is testimony day.
Hi, Larry. This
George?
is George Bullard. And I was pleased to matriculate at Southern Seminary the entire decade of the 70s. And those were really good times for me. And had you and Emmanuel McCall and Wade Rowott as professors. And those were engaging kind of times, and really set me up for solid ministry. I was close to you, having graded for you. I was close to Willis, Russell Bennett, particularly, and other different folks like that. I want to tell you, one of the things I did when I read your book, which I really appreciate, is that I had never read your Jimmy Allen biography. And so I pulled that out. I had it, but I never read it. And I pulled that out and read it and kind of compared, different seasons when you were writing about the controversy and different ways and perspectives of looking at things.
George, you helped me have more opportunities than any other person I can name. You and Jerry Allen, between the two of you. I would never have had the opportunities through the Home Mission Board that I had and other places as well without your encouragement and support. Thanks.
Thank you. Larry, Buddy McGahan, he's sitting beside you on the link, and I were there. We started in 1958. Manuel McCall came during that time. And the professors I remember that really set my theology of who I am, people like Eric Rush, Dale Moody, Bill Hall, Willis Bennett. Now that was a different era, but it was only a year after the 13 professors had left, less than a year. And those other professors came in who had, not been professors before. But I just feel that I got a conservative in the right meaning of that word from these three that probably meant more to me than any other.
Larry, you and I were in Southwestern Seminary at the same time. I think I graduated a year ahead of you. And then we met again at Southern Seminary. I just had a very strong transition from Southwestern to Southern. I remember when Frank Tupper and I were in a colloquium right after we moved to Louisville. And after the colloquium, Leo Garrett, my major professor, asked, were you guys allowed to talk at Southwestern at all? Because we were so into things. It was like a breath of fresh air for me. You were very positive towards your experience at Southwestern. Do you have anything more to say there? I think I was in a class with Bill Pinson with you when he came back from a visit with Bill Moyers right after President Johnson moved into the White House. And Bill was the press secretary, of course. They were close friends in seminary.
I did not have any negative experiences per se at Southwestern. I just felt that culturally, I needed to know Southern Baptist outside of Oklahoma and Texas. And as I say in the book, I actually applied to Southeastern. But I was getting married. My wife wasn't going to go to Southeastern. And it wouldn't have worked for us. But it was a big decision for us to uproot from the Southwest to Kentucky. But Kentucky was the state of my father's family's background. So it was kind of a homecoming in that sense. I want to say, while we're talking here, that Larry and Carolyn DePoy were enormous helps for the moderate side in the controversy. I've tried to describe that, but I couldn't describe it completely. But just publicly, we're grateful to the two of you for what you did in putting together the call and being involved in an active way during the controversy.
The transition from Southwest. I'm a native Texan, went to Hardin Simmons, And to go to Southern Seminary, at that time considered the liberal seminary, was a real radical thing for a Texan to do. And I got a lot of flack from my Texan buddies, all of whom went to Southwestern, of course. But it was Southern, it was the greatest thing that God led me to do, to go to Southern, because that was my home. It opened my eyes to a new world. You mentioned various professors, some of those you named I would agree with. Clyde Francisco was one that really opened my eyes to. Jeremiah, he was the Jeremiah expert. And really, I did a revival one time with him in the little church that I was serving part-time. And he was so very gracious, very gracious.
Thank you, George.
Hey,
Larry.
this is David Tuck. One of my favorite stories, my first Southern Baptist convention was in '85. And believe it or not, I sat between Willis Bennett and Molly Marshall. And Molly had a turkey caller with her. And every time Charles Stanley would say something stupid, Molly would threaten to blow her turkey caller. And Willis Bennett would reach across me and grab her arm and get the turkey caller from her. Now, knowing Molly, she probably would have blown that turkey caller, but I'm hoping that she was only threatening to do it. And if you remember that convention, Charles Stanley had us to group around in smaller groups and have prayer. So here Willis and Molly and I would circle around and giggle more than we prayed about what Molly was attempting to do when Charles Stanley was doing his thing. So that was a great memory, and got to know Willis and Molly very well that week. When I graduated in '85, Willis, of course, shook my hand to all of the graduates coming across the stage. And he looked up at me and he said, "Congratulations, my prayer buddy." And so that was his moniker for me, even after that, on through the years. And I have to tell a story about Emmanuel McCall. I heard Emmanuel preach back before 1986 or so, a sermon called Shamgar and His Stick. And it was a fascinating sermon about this obscure Old Testament character. And when I graduated from Southern, I went to a little mountain church in Rogersville, Tennessee, and became moderator of Holston Valley Baptist Association. And it was my responsibility to invite someone to preach from one of the Southern Baptist entities around. And I wanted Emmanuel to come and preach that sermon, Shamgar and His Stick. And I invited him to come, and he came. So I was privileged to hear Emmanuel preach Shamgar and His Stick 2 times. And I hope that I live long enough and Emmanuel lives long enough that I can hear it a 3rd time, because it's a fascinating story and a fascinating take on that obscure character. So thank you, Emmanuel. And hello, Pat Cole. Pat and I were at Southern at the same time. David Myers was in Hamilton County when I served in northwest Georgia. So a lot of good Wade Route was, of course, at Southern when I was there, and then met Larry more during the D-Min work from '88 to '91. So it's good to see all of your faces of old friends.
While you're there, David, I want to say a word of gratitude to David. David is the publisher of this book. He started the press, Parsons Porch, some years ago. And I've worked with, I think, 5 different publishers on books through the years. And his process is the easiest and the most helpful and the quickest of any way of publishing. So if you got a stack of sermons you want to put together, or a book you've just been dying to get published, I'd like to recommend that you consider Parsons Porch. This is the only advertisement in this presentation, but I'm grateful to David for all of his shepherding of this. I turned in a manuscript to him, and within 10 days, it was ready to be printed. And I had a contract offered me on another book, and it was going to take 2 years to do that. So anything you want to add to your process briefly, David, while you got the full?
Just a thumbnail history. John Killinger and I became friends years ago, and on his 75th birthday, I'm sorry, I published a test script for him. And when he saw the book, he said, I needed to do this full time. And I said, okay, send me some manuscripts. And he did. And later, his son, Eric, opened his own publishing company, and John and Ann moved their books to Eric. So John kind of spurred me on with this. And so that was in 2007 or 8. And so he kicked me out of the nest, so to speak. And here we are 15 years later. And I started doing this full time in 2010. So it's really been fun. And we still try to keep the commitment of, once we get a completed manuscript, that we do get it finished and ready for the author's final approval in 7 to 10 days. And we hit that target fairly often. Sometimes it takes us a bit longer to get it back to the author and finish up the details. But it was a great honor to be able to work with Larry. We met up again at the Claypool Our Glad reunion in September, and Larry told me he was sending this to me, and so I was very excited to be able to participate. But it was spooky to be the publisher of the book and living through that on Southern Seminary's campus from 82 to 85, and then again from 88 to 91. And also the rush that we D-Min students had to make sure we finished before Roy Honeycutt retired, so no one else's signature would be on our degree. And fortunately, most of us did that and were able to finish with Roy's. And that may have been the last graduation he was actually president, maybe 92. I can't remember the dates actually, but we graduated May of 91 with the D-Min, and Larry, of course, is very instrumental in that. So Larry and I have come in and out of each other's lives several times, particularly with Willis Bennett and the turkey calling controversy in 1985.
One last thing there. The process David uses, of course, is on demand, and he doesn't print a book until somebody orders it. Now, the great advantage of that is he can correct errors between publications. So I already found 2 or 3 errors in the book and sent them to him. And so the next book that comes out won't have those errors in it. And that's remarkable technology. Enough there. Who would like to speak? James,
I'm a fellow Texan, and George's comments prompted me to remember the assessment of where to go to school consideration. I mean, prayerful discernment. And we heard it a little bit different, George, where I came from. We use that great symbolic greatest of evil vice, smoking, is the marker. So what I heard in Texas was smoking was forbidden at Southwestern. It was allowed at Southern, but it was required at Southeastern. So I think that's a good one. I've used it over the years. That puts Southeastern over on the left edge there, of course, with all the good Tennessee, Kentucky folk. I think one of my next kind of revelations about what was going on with this was, I think it was 79, the convention 79, was that St. Louis? Whether it was 79 or not.
Houston.
Well,
79 was Houston.
It must have been the year before or afterwards, but because it was in St. Louis, I drove across
1980 was St. Louis.
Okay, it was in 80 then. And, I was just a poor student, so I was looking for housing anywhere, and they put up some students at Adrian's church. Is it Bellevue? I guess slept on cots or whatever. And there were a bunch of Mid-America students there. I didn't know what Mid-America students were about, but I was overhearing them talk about their great anxiety and obviously their teachers' concern about these raving liberal professors and scholars who it turns out were neo-Orthodox people. And I remember thinking, wow, where I was taught neo-Orthodox was a lot closer to the middle of the road than literal liberal folks. But that gave me a little framework where Mid-America and some of those folks were coming from. The other piece moving forward, when I found out about church and community, that confirmed where I wanted to do doctoral work, because I am thankful to this day for Willis and Larry and putting together that very unique program that I think is still sorely needed. My third area is with Paul Simmons in ethics. But I was reminded, Larry, that there was so much going on that so many of us weren't aware of. I mean, I knew there were, people rallying the troops and this and that, but even the time that you invested, I never felt like I was not getting all the attention from you and the other teachers that I had in my doctoral program, even though there was this great duress going on, obviously, for so many of them. So thanks for both your work behind the scenes. But you wonder, and we wondered at the time, do people really know what's going on with this? If more moderate people knew, would they be concerned? Would they show up at these meetings? I think in the end, I conclude that this was just part of a much larger wave of division and dichotomy of thinking and acting that was this just sweeping through the land. And while we usually think our faith affects our politics and our economic perspectives and our stuff around citizenship, I think it works the other way as much or more, which some research has suggested. So I'm not sure what this division was not inevitable, but I know it was really, really painful for a lot of folks.
We have Paul from church music, Mike from Christian education, and Bob Johnson from voice school. Was there any real impact that the effects of the controversy were having in your schools when you were there?
You mean other than killing it?
Other than killing.
Other than what?
Other
Killing
than
it.
killing it.
Yeah, well,
I
go ahead,
made the observation, I'm going to say 1991, but I could be off, when we were having one of our usual lunchtime gatherings of School of Church Music faculty. And I said, look, it is possible to have a healthy body and a sick limb, but you can't have a healthy limb on a sick body. And that was certainly not the only cultural thing affecting us, but yes, it certainly affected our day-to-day work, not when I was a student in the 70s, but over our shoulders in the 80s and clearly in the 90s.
How did that affect?
How?
Yes,
By the amount of time and energy that it absorbed, by the constant stress. If you were on the faculty at Southern in that period, we had a 3-part liturgical year. Before the trustees come when you're anxious, while the trustees are there and you're anxious, and when the trustees leave and you're anxious.
but how did it affect the music itself, the style of music and so forth?
It had less to do with style than with devotion of resources and openness to make commitments. It did make some difference in musical style and in worship style, but that had less to do with fundamentalists than it did with American culture.
Were the women treated as equally after the fundamentalists had more control?
No.
My observation was, and we're almost all white male here except for Emmanuel, this was a lot about our inclusion attitude. And Larry, I'd like to hear you talk more about race. But we had just hired a pastoral care professor, and Al did not bring him because he was black. And I've read a lot of this about theology, but also about inclusiveness racially and gender-wise as major issues that were cultural, as you've already noted, as well as more than theological, probably.
Can I jump in there for a minute? I haven't read Larry's book yet, but I have read Lane Scales and Melody Maxwell's Doing the Word about the Carver School. And I would recommend it to anyone. It deals with the broader cultural issues. And it's a very well written and very well researched book. I think none of us were unaffected by this simply because of the nature of community. And I have to look back at my own time as a student. All the ills that we now identify in American culture and see more clearly, we were present and in some ways committed to them. And our religion endorsed them. I'll be quiet now.
You want to hear from Boyce?
Yeah.
Okay, I've got two or three. I didn't know if my story is going to be worth hearing today, but now it is. I'm a Southwestern graduate, BD, ED, MRE, PhD. Couple of things. I had Jerry Vardaman for biblical introduction. I had TB Maston for ethics. I had James Leo Garrett while he was there for something, I forgot what, it'd be in theology. And since Dockery has gone to Southwestern, and Dockery was my supervisor, and if we have time, I'd like Larry to reflect on David Dockery. But anyway, David was going along good, but he had to use the term inerrancy since he's gone to Southwestern. I never heard the word at Southwestern when I was there. We studied theories of inspiration, but I never heard the word inerrancy. So Southwestern was what I needed. I probably wouldn't have been ready for Southern, okay? I came out of East Texas and kind of middle of the road person, but Southwestern was good for me. And I may be a little rare here. I also served 11 years on the faculty at Midwestern with the guys that had been fired at Southern. And I loved going to eat Captain D's fish with Bill Morton, and to see the way he used the vinegar, the right amount of vinegar on his fish, as if he were an archaeologist. I recently talked to Sam Valentine, who came there to fill in directly from Oxford. And we named those the golden years from 79 for the next few years. Those were golden years at Midwestern. That was a fun place to be.
Yes.
With 12 people. Then I turned down a job to go to Southwestern to teach adult education. And then came to Boyce. They'd already hired somebody to be the dean at Boyce. And I called Tom Smothers, my friend, and said, what about, I might be interested in Boyce. He said, so he talked to Willis, and Willis said, well, we've already hired somebody or offered the job, but tell Bob to send his stuff. And so I came over for a visit, And if I'm correct, Larry McSwain said, I'm not sure if he's interested. You remember that, Larry?
No, I don't.
When you all were considering me, you told Willis, I'm not sure he's interested. But I was just playing it coy. I didn't want to act so. Number one, maybe because I had been a faculty member for 11 years at Midwestern, I was accepted on a level beyond what I think the Dean of Boyce Bible School had been accepted in previous times.
No doubt about it.
So we started out the process. Roy and Bill Rogers started out to get me to be a tenured professor in the Christian education school. They backed out because they didn't think I could pass the test of the trustees. So I'm honored about that. Of course, we had graduation twice a year. And the first 3 years, Roy was here. The rest of the time, what's his name? Al was the president. David Dockery, and then also Danny. And I would say Danny, but Danny, Dockery treated me nicely. Danny treated me especially nice. We talked openly. We knew we were on different tracks, but he was respectful of me. I'll just say that about him. I remember when Dockery was around, we would have a meal before our graduation, and we always invited Al, the president, and David, or whoever was his right-hand man. And I remember Dockery and Al going through the line, getting all this beautiful food, talking about them wishing that Molly Marshall would go away. That was something I overheard from them. Another one, you won't know about this, but in the summer, it had been the custom at Boyce. Are y'all finished? Okay, bye. I'll send you a text. My house cleaners. So where was I? Oh, okay. In the summertime, for instance, Herschel Hobbs, people like that were brought in here in the summertime to teach a special course for, I don't know, a week or 2 weeks, something like that. And I remember Herschel Hobbs loved these little, who made the little bitty hamburgers?
White Castle.
Yeah, he loved White Castle hamburgers. And June Honeycutt took him to White Castle to get his hamburger. So, okay, so after I came, well, I had been pastor in Arizona near Richard Jackson. Richard Jackson had also been pastor with me in accompanying towns in Texas. So I knew Richard. And so we were going to bring Richard to teach one of those summer things. And it was sometime when he and Al had gotten in a tit-tat. And so in the process, I was traveling out of town on business. They sent, I don't know who they sent over, but they rifled my files to see if I had written a letter to Richard saying he'd been approved to teach. Thank God I didn't do that, because Richard was never approved to teach. And I had not written any letter. But all of my files were gone through by someone.
My goodness.
The other, but Boyce students, by the way, when I was there, and I'm sure before, there was a equality experienced by the men and women, believe this or not. there was a group of our men students who went over to a church where one of our female students was being ordained and supported her in that. So we had some bright lights in boys.
Yeah.
And one of those, I'll close with this because I think I've taken enough time.
Yeah.
The CBF missionaries in Ukraine, and help me, Benatti.
Podolsky.
Okay. June Honeycutt raised the money to bring about 8 Russian students one summer. Pastor of First Baptist Church, where the University of Georgia is, taught them preaching. Gennady was the only one that had a little English. So he would hear what was said by the teacher, and then we circled them up, and then he would tell them. So here's where I want to go though. When Gennady graduated from Boyce, we let everybody give a testimony. He was supportive of Al and thanked Al Mohler for all that he had done to make Southern Seminary a good seminary now. And now Gennady is a CBF missionary.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Bob Terry, were you trying to get in a moment ago?
Well, I had 2 things that I wanted to ask about, and I'm seeking information. When I came to Southern in '65, Eric Rust was known for going into churches and confronting fundamentalists. And he frequently said, I just attacked their presuppositions before they attacked mine. And I wondered what changed from the late 60s and before that, because I just knew him in the late 60s, when he was doing that, that made such confrontation, well, it made him a target, of course, but that those kind of discussions couldn't take place anymore. But that's one question. The second one, Larry, is for you and those who were on faculty in the late 80s. You remember that Roy brought in a former SBC Executive Committee associate president or chairman or what. I can't remember his name. I was looking for his book on the executive committee, but I can't find it. And he interviewed all of the faculty about their theology. I wondered what the faculty thought of Roy bringing people in, bringing this man in especially, to do a conversation with every faculty member. Do you recall that?
Well, I know who you're talking about, I think.
I'm sorry, I can't
pull the name out.
Yeah, I can't either. But a fantastic
I
man.
didn't know he interviewed faculty members, but
Yeah.
he could spend a semester or longer, long time person.
Albert
through the
McClellan.
SBC.
Albert McClellan, thank you. Yeah, thank
What's
you.
his name?
Yes. Yeah,
What's his name? Somebody say his
Albert
name?
McClellan.
Albert McClellan, exactly.
Yeah.
But I didn't know he interviewed people about their theology.
He did. He interviewed a goodly number of them, and in fact, he made a report to the president.
Well, that's interesting.
And I know about that because I used that part of that report in some editorials that I did in Missouri in those days.
Well, I know he had a document on the controversy that Coffin referred to frequently in his book. But I asked Buddy Sheridan about that, and he knew of it, but he had never read it. And I don't know that it was ever available to the public in any broad way. Wade, do you have information on that?
Bob, I was interviewed by Albert and talked with him at great length, and my memory would be slightly different from what you just said. I think he was brought in to survey alumni and to talk to faculty and others about the strengths and weaknesses of Southern Seminary might have been theology, and that might have been part of it. But I did not feel in any way that it was, is your theology acceptable during the
Oh,
interview?
yeah. Albert wouldn't do that.
But I remember that as being one point at which we got some helpful feedback from alumni about the need for more practical division courses, require preaching, church administration, church and community. And I think Larry and Willis, maybe at that point and some others, began to tweak the track some from some of that. So I think the data was broader than theology, but I could be wrong.
I'm sure it was broader than theology, but theology was a part of it. You know, for example, he had some lengthy discussions with Glenn Henson. And I saw some of the written report. And that's just, I wondered if it just created what it was like at Southern when that was going on. Evidently, it was a non-issue.
Well, you know,
Okay.
Bob, in the mid 1970s, Albert
Discussion
McClellan.
just a minute. Those of you who have read the book, what would you like to challenge? What did you see, hear, or read, or come across that you want to disagree with, or challenge, or take issue with? Anybody want to get critical? Okay.
Larry, how did I get your book? How
I'm
did I
sorry?
get your book?
Who's speaking? I'm lost.
Dewey Mayfield.
Okay. Well, there are three ways. You can go online at Parsons Porch and order it directly from the publisher. You can go on Amazon and buy it for $21.99, I think it is. Or you can mail me a check for $17 and I'll mail you one.
All right.
If I still have some, I think I'm down to my last one or two, but I'll be
Well, either go to Amazon or Parsons Porch. I'll do one or the other.
okay.
Larry, I dropped a letter and a check in the mail requesting one. You run out before it gets there. Will I get one?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll hold one for you, Wade.
Larry, I know someone who will sell you a batch of them if you need them.
I didn't understand you, David.
I said, I know someone who will send you a batch of your books if you need some more.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm still obligated to 50 more.
That's good.
Larry, this is
Yeah.
Lee Morris. I would have liked to have had you say something about the psychology of absolutism. I sensed a lot of absolutism in the righteous insurrection. They were absolutely right up there with God himself. And I think that is a dangerous sentiment. It can ruin churches, ruin the seminary. It ruined Germany, the Nazi regime. And I would like to hear you now, if you will, say something about that.
I made a passing mention of that. I considered going back to the old classic book by Adorno, The Authoritarian Personality or Authoritarian Mind.
Right.
But I felt like that was kind of chasing a rabbit. But our friend from Sanford, Fisher Humphrey, book does a wonderful job of describing the elements of fundamentalism and addresses the different theological focus of fundamentalism, but also the need for control. And I do refer to that, and that's as far as I went with it, but I think you're exactly right. And if you look at the personality, the primary model of that, of course, was our good friend, the three-time president from Tennessee,
Adrian.
Rogers. He was the classic authoritarian dictator.
Yes.
And he had no ability to negotiate his opinion on anything. He was one of my favorite preachers. I loved to hear him preach. Thought he was fabulous.
That's your reference to embedded beliefs.
I'm sorry.
Embedded beliefs. You talk about that on page 45. The embedded belief where you can't change.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, thank you, George.
I'm glad I broke out of that because I had that embedded belief before I went to Southern. And it changed. Can I follow up with just a little bit of the journey?
Go ahead.
I got so divided over it. I changed my ordination, went through the change of ordination process. I think I shared it with you, to the Disciples of Christ Christian Church back in the early 90s. And I was told by them that you've been a disciple all along, the inclusiveness and so forth. But I have since moved to Nacogdoches. There's not a disciples church here. And of course, I've told some of you that with Kyle Childress and Austin Heights Baptist Church, affiliated with Alliance of Baptists and CBF, I've returned to the Baptist fold, but I'm duly ordained still with the disciples. But it's been an interesting journey, and your book has paralleled a lot of experiences that I had going through all that.
Thank you, George. I'm going to suggest that we allow those who have not yet spoken the opportunity to speak. So if you haven't spoken up and you want to say something, now's a good time to jump in.
I'm sorry that I've not gotten the book because of some visual problems I'm going through. But as soon as the doctor gives me a clearance, I will.
Hey, classmate.
What do you think, Emmanuel, about the thesis? I'm going to go back to what I was saying about Randall Palmer. His argument is that the fundamentalist movement came up with using abortion as one of the primary social agendas as a more popular way to generate support, but they were really concerned about the racial pressures they were facing with this private academy business going on in the South. Do you have an opinion about that?
No, I really don't. Except I'm against it. But I did remember when Bob Terry came on just a minute ago. He and I were on the alumni committee, and we had to deal with some issues relating to Al Mohler's coming. And Bob may wanted to say more about that, but it was a very tense 3 years being on as the president-elect and then president and past president of the Alumni Association, and some of the challenges that we had there. Bob, your memory is probably better than mine at that.
I don't have much to contribute right here, other than the flawed process that went, the stacked process that it went through. Yeah. But, while Roy was a fan of Al's at the time of his election,
that's right.
Roy also said of the people leading the takeover effort, these people are not Baptist. He said that very clearly as we were preparing for an alumni event. And I wouldn't differ with what Dr. Honeycutt said as the changes were made.
I'd like to hear what George Bullard, I think, was cranking up to say at one point, but didn't say.
Though I indicated that I matriculated for the decade of the 70s, the last 4 years of that was not in Louisville. I had finished my classwork for my DMin, my third degree, and then I was in Baltimore, Maryland on a 2-year assignment, and then in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the 1979 SBC was the one that the big Billy Graham thing in Houston, and it was broadcast by satellite all over the country. And I remember being at Pritchard Memorial Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, and hearing the news of that convention. And though I had known about the controversy all through the 70s, because my father was a state executive director during the 70s in Pennsylvania, I left that night saying, oh crap, my whole ministry is going to be this controversy now. And that was the feeling I came away with in 1970. But the question I was going to raise was, where do you all see the beginning point of all of this? Because I would go back to at least the Elliott controversy, and then the formation after the 1963 Baptist Faith and Message of the Baptist Faith and Message Fellowship. That's where I would go. So I'm just curious to see what some of the rest of you all think.
George, I think it goes back to the race issue way before that. And Larry, if I might, I want to share one brief vignette that sealed that in my mind and sealed desire to get out. When I was associate dean for the DMin program and was making a report to a subcommittee of the trustees, I reported that we had doubled the number of Black pastors that we had accepted in the DMin program the previous year. A trustee unapologetically interrupted my report and said, Dr. Rowett, just how far down did you have to compromise the admission standards to get those Black people in here? Larry, you know me well enough to know that I'm not always even-tempered and well-toothed, and I lost it. I said, sir, not quite as far as we have to for the average pastor, and I called his home state. He said, sir, I resent that remark. And I said, not half as much as I resent that question. But interrupted us and said, gentlemen, we will return to the agenda. Wager report is over. But I walked out of that room that day convinced that we were fighting the battle for the dignity of our Black brothers and sisters. That for me, at least, a lot of the inerrancy and other controversies were a cover for the racism that we were fighting. Now, I may be absolutely wrong and blinded by my own experience, but that was my feeling of when it started.
It's been okay.
I think racism and feminism.
Seminary right now, Claire.
Absolutely.
Southern was pretty far out there by the mid 80s in terms of its support for women and the ordination of women and leadership of women. And that was not well accepted in the broad grassroots, I would say.
Larry,
I think that
I'm sorry I lost the letter, but the letter asking for my resignation stated that I must never speak publicly in the classroom or from a pulpit in support of ordination of women was one of the 10 things they demanded I would be fired for if I didn't resign. So I agree 100%.
Well, I agree that feminism and racism, but I really think when you go back to the beginning, somebody said abortion, it's really Jerry Falwell. It's moral majority in the abortion issue. I don't think abortion was even an issue anywhere until he came along. And I see that as kind of the beginning of where all this stuff started.
Well, the Southern Baptist Convention, did they not approve a resolution affirming abortion in the first trimester in 1971 based upon W.A. Criswell standing up and supporting it.
Right,
Yes.
that's what I understand.
Yeah.
And it continued until 1978, was reaffirmed every year till 78.
Yeah.
But
no, you all
could
don't think
talk
this goes
about
back to the
abortion, you couldn't
60s.
talk about race.
Yeah. You
You
don't think
could-
this goes back to the late 50s, early 60s then? You all think it started in the late 60s, early 70s? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the moral majority, and I remember Falwell, I remember in the 60s, I was in Roanoke, it was in Lynchburg. And I don't know though when the moral majority began. I'm not sure the date.
70s.
May have been later.
70s.
Okay.
Which credit do you give to Pressler and the other guy that was president of Southwestern who talked about the dinner where they had a meeting about the direction of the convention, and they, Page Patterson. And Patterson had just been denied his doctorate. And somehow I heard the report that that was the starting point of the frustration.
Cafe du Monde.
Yeah, that was an organizational catalyst, but we have to remember the Baptist and Faith and Message Fellowship that was in the 60s was raising a lot of these issues. Some of you may remember that a rally was held at 9th and O in the late 60s or the early 70s. Bill Hall went over and spoke, and then the 9th and O pastor grilled him with 10 questions about, do you believe Adam and Eve were a literal man and woman? And, you know, a whole series of 10 questions after Bill had just done a great job from the pulpit. And that, you know, they had their own publication going, and they were raising trouble in the 60s before we ever got to 79.
Okay.
Well, friends, it's easy for us to be self-congratulatory, but I've done a good bit of work in the early history of Southern Baptists. And my grandfather was a second career student in Louisville during World War I and the pandemic of influenza. We carry the seeds of all of these things in our genes.
Yes.
That is not to say that we are complicit, but we had all of that with us all along, and we didn't see far enough even when we saw slightly ahead.
I won't.
Ralph, are you with us? I see your name here.
Who?
Dennis Faust. Are you with us, Dean?
I am with you.
May I ask you a question?
Sure can.
You're the pastor of a strong progressive church. What are the stresses and the flow in terms of pastoral leadership in this moment in time compared to these backward looks we're talking about here today?
On a Thursday afternoon, I have enjoyed so much listening to the stories, and you know, for me, the challenge today, coming out of the pandemic, has its own set of challenges. We've discussed that on another day. But I'm convinced more and more that people live in such an informational overridden. I remember John Naisbitt in Megatrends made a statement that has stayed with me. We are drowning in information and thirsting for knowledge. And I think trying to serve people today in a progressive church at the heart of a city, trying to pull our messaging together and then communicate that to the city, trying to encourage people who feel burdened already by knowing that they're a minority group wherever they go, and trying to help them develop theological and biblical reflection literacy. When quite bluntly, I think that's one of the things that progressives have never been very good at. We have known what we were against, but we've not done a very good job of knowing what we were for. And so part of my challenge now is I'm offering some messages during Epiphany on Baptist practices. And what I'm trying to do is help the people understand that a historic Baptist principle isn't really worth a whole lot. We don't practice those today. And so that's one of the challenges that I have. Another challenge I have is trying to help people look at the world through their understanding of their own experience, honestly, while at the same time, kind of like all of us sit in that chair at the ophthalmologist office, is this better? Is this better? And so while I try to let them describe, what do you see through your lens of experience? And then I'll put on there, what do you see through the lens of all of the news media today and current political climate, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'll try to click over to the Jesus lens and say, is that better? Is that better? And so I think those are some of the challenges that I confront, to be fully honest also. And I have a wonderful staff of people that I get to work alongside every day. But one of the things I grieve with the loss of our seminaries is the lack of vision. When we started, I mean, if a convention of millions of people only needed 6 seminaries, why in the hell do we need 15 for progressive groups today? I don't get it. We have too many. We need maybe 2 strong ones that would really put out people who care about the local church and are committed to it. I think what we're doing right now is we are primarily training people who were not raised in healthy churches, who don't want to serve the church at all. And quite often the people who show up, the divinity degrees they have had almost no congregational training in them. And most of them were taught in recent years by people who have no congregational leadership experience. And so that's one of the challenges that I face, and one of the things I agree about the loss of good seminaries. So if I ran enough.
That gives us all a lot to think about.
Can you hear me? Am I on? Okay.
Yeah.
This is Chuck Bogg. I agree with Dennis. The thing that grieves me, and I work some with younger ministers in preaching on Zoom, but I've taught at several different seminaries, and for a while we had some very outstanding young women and young men who were going into the pastoral ministry. The last preaching class I taught, and I won't name the seminary, I had nobody in the class who was going in to the pastoral ministry.
Yeah.
They were going into social work. I mean, they were going into good things. Nobody can argue that they weren't very committed to helping and serving people. But I wonder about the future of the church, because it seems to me that there are a lot of churches right now that are struggling to keep the lights on, much less to do much envisioning of what the church can do in the world.
Mhm. Well, and this Dennis again, I want to just say a word though to each of you all on this call, and I apologize, I'm kind of on the run today, but so I've not allowed the camera to work. But the challenge I think that I don't want us to overlook is the challenge that all of you faced who were professors. I arrived at Southern Seminary in 1981 and finished the doctoral work writing in absentia, finishing in 1988, because Bill Hendricks kept calling me in San Antonio and saying, you need to get that in, you need to get that in. But I can't tell, I mean, Mike Harton, who was such a gift to me upon arrival at Southern, you know, I had grown up in the General Association of General Baptists, the General Atonement Baptist out of Poplar Bluff, Missouri, and Oakland City, Indiana. And so we were always anti-Calvinist, anti-fundamentalists, but they did not know what to do with someone with a doctoral degree. And so I saw what was going on. Mike welcomed me in, the seminary welcomed me in, all of those all those conversations with professors down at Jim Porter's Tavern. I would look around the table and I was the only student sitting there with all of you folks, and it was amazing. And so I'm grateful that I had that time, but I'm so grateful to all of you who were professors in that time that you never allowed the bitterness that was going on around you to become the appetite and the expression of your faith expression. You could have done that so easily. But I mean, I remember sitting in Frank Tupper's theology class, noticing a tape recorder in a woman's backpack, knowing she was sending those notes to Dallas, going to him after class and telling him what I had seen. And he said, yeah, she was in this class last semester too. And his wife was dying and he was dealing with that, but it never made him bitter. So that's what I got out of theology. And I am so grateful for that, to each of you and all those others who were part of that culture at that time.
Well, we've been going at it about an hour and a half. Are you ready to hang it up? And
I want to ask a forward-looking question.
okay.
At Beeson, we're looking for a professor of evangelism. Needs to be a Southern Baptist. Needs to be properly credentialed. Needs to be properly experienced. We're having trouble finding somebody. If y'all have any suggestions, I'd appreciate hearing.
I can't tell you the last time I gave a damn about Southern Baptist.
Bob, if they're a Southern Baptist with a
excuse me, sir,
if they're a Southern Baptist with a 1963 Baptist Faith and Message commitment,
yeah,
would they be eligible?
That's what we use at Sanford.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have any foggiest notion of who to suggest, but
we don't either. You know, they need to, I said Southern Baptist, they need to be Baptist.
Well,
I need to clarify that.
They need to be independent Baptist or fundamentalist Baptist or Southern Baptist to be, let's be honest.
I would differ with you.
They can't be Baptist.
I would differ with you.
There ain't nobody who's connected to the Alliance of Baptists that's going to be acceptable.
That's probably
There are
true.
5 non-Baptist chairs at Beeson. There were 2 Black full-time faculty members, a lady who taught psychology, and she had been raised as a nun in Baltimore, Maryland, and we had wonderful Robert Smith as our homiletician.
Yeah.
We had
Beeson, that Beeson.
wonderful students in all fields. And one of the problems I had was that we had also some very exaggerated, totally reformed Presbyterians.
Yeah.
And they don't have much wiggle room either for their doctrinariness. But I see some good signs breaking free. I want to compliment Bob Terry because what a great job he did with Alabama Baptist for so many years. And he turned over his position to a woman, a graduate of Beeson Divinity School. Now, what I want to know is how many of the Southern Baptist Convention news weeklies are run by women. All right. I also had a chance to work in New York City for 19 years. And we had blacks, whites, Hispanics, Ukrainians, Russians, Japanese in the Metropolitan New York Baptist Association. There were 20 different ethnic groups. Now, if you get up into a situation like that and get out of the cotton buttermilk belt of the South, you will find a need for all kinds of people. And you will also experience the glory of working with other Christians that don't have to wear strict Baptist credentials. And some of the best and brightest Baptists I knew, I had the privilege of pastoring around in the time I was in the Northeast. We're pretty narrow-minded from our experiences and where we've lived and what we've fought with. And many of you are very, very faithful and longtime members of Southern Baptist Seminary. And it broke my heart to see that I think I understood at one point, 87% of the faculty I'd studied under, from my MDiv to my PhD studies, were gone. And that was awful. And I was president of the convention up there when Bailey, who was from Oklahoma, Del City, Oklahoma.
Bailey Smith.
Bailey Smith made a public report about his election as president. And somebody asked him about the Jews. He said, well, they had funny noses. That set back our work with Jewish people probably 10 years. You know, we've got, and George Bullard, you're a wonderful guy. I enjoyed following your father as state executive in Pennsylvania.
Right.
A wonderful, solid Christian man who took over because the other man had died after 1 year in office.
Right.
And that was a great privilege. There were also some great Ukrainian Baptists in the Philadelphia area. It aggravated. I was on a ordination committee for a woman in 1976 in New York City, a Baptist church in Brooklyn. We elected a Black Baptist pastor to be president of the Baptist Convention of New Jersey and Pennsylvania in 1990. Is there anybody in the Southern Baptist Convention that had a state Baptist president that was Black? It's wonderful to see what God has done with Baptists, and it's also shameful. You know, a Georgetown College graduate down at First Baptist Orlando was the one that led the convention, and finally having a repentance time over our seriousness against Blacks and holding them out of our churches. And that was
Jim Henry.
Yeah.
Jim Henry, yeah.
Jim Henry. Yeah.
He was not the man they had lined up to win. You know, he broke the College of Cardinals control of who was going to get to be president. A good man. And he sweated over that and lost a lot of friends over it. But we need to hang on and push for the progressive, more open view. I had a chance to work with Catholic priests in marriages and in funerals, and a chance to work with other denominations. And it really made me angry when in the Baptist Convention of Kentucky, that actual resolutions were made. If your church gives to more than anybody else in Southern Baptist, we're going to tell them we don't want them. They're particularly trying to pick out all the people that give to the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And I told some people, I said, if have you ever worked with black churches? We had wonderful black churches in New York and in the Pennsylvania Convention when I was the executive there. I said almost all of those churches give to multiple organizations. And if you insist on them all giving everything to the Southern Baptists, we're going to lose half our churches and we'll be that much the poorer for it. We've got a lot to learn, and there's a lot of hideousness going on in Southern Baptist life still. And I hope we'll keep working at it. One of the things I enjoyed about working with Timothy George is he'd been a pastor up in Boston, and when he was a student at Harvard. And I think if we would kind of break out of some boundaries and start getting training and maybe a little bit more open places, we would find some good things that we could learn. I just wanted to say that. I'm sorry it was too much, and I didn't. Forgive me for sounding like I'm preaching, but there's some wonderful things going on out there that we don't know about that we must hang on to. And
Larry,
thank you for your response, and I learned a lot about where you've been. I didn't know. Appreciate it.
Larry,
Are you ready to wrap her up?
Larry, I want to say this. Get back to the book a sec.
Yeah.
I remember sitting around the lunch table in the faculty lounge, and you usually sitting right in the middle, and people were asking you questions like crazy, and you were talking about what was going on and what had happened. But then you would say, and that's, this is where it's going. Now, you were reporting facts up to that point, but then you would put it together and you would prophesy. You were a prophet. You were a prophet.
Well, thank you.
the prophets didn't get asked to lunch very much, did they?
No,
Larry, I have a question for you.
Tupper was
They're
mentioned a
important.
while ago, and I didn't give the full detail in the book, but on my 46th birthday, Tupper put together a birthday party, and he wrote a resolution about a page and a half long of calling me a prophet. So I've heard that before.
Amen.
I was never the prophet that could prophesy the future. But you're kind to say that, Mike. I appreciate it very much.
Larry, I do have a question for you, and that is, I know you as having been a strong supporter of the forces within the convention trying to fight this for years. As you have written this, and as you look back on it, what wisdom would you have as we move forward in fighting the current fundamentalist crisis in our politics, in our churches across denominational lines?
To be honest with you, I don't know. We're in a political polarization in this country that is affecting the church, and the longer it lasts, the weaker the church will become.
Amen.
The kingdom is not built on controversy. The kingdom is built on following Jesus. And we got an awful lot of Christians that are more politicians than they are followers of Jesus on both sides of the fence. I see a weakening of congregational life as a result of all of that. And when you look at and we've talked about this before on this forum, when you look at the age structure of our society, and the impact of faith on the young, we're in trouble. We're in deep trouble. We're raising a generation of children who've never had an experience of church involvement. And as adults, will have never had that experience. And it's a rapidly growing percent of that youthful population. Europe looks more like the model in my mind as church life goes. By the way, since Mike mentioned gathering for lunch, I got to tell one story. You know, we all used to gather in the faculty lounge and bring our lunch. And one day we gathered around the table there eating, and Dale Moody is there, and I'm there, and David, oh gosh, Garland, David Garland. And he said, who got my lunch? He'd gone to the refrigerator in there to get his sack lunch out, and it was gone. And he looked down, and Dale Moody was eating his lunch. And I mean, he didn't go ballistic. Moody had gone in and picked up the wrong package and eaten. Well, that's silliness. You ready to wrap it up?
Larry, may I ask if you know the book From Distrust to Trust, Controversies and Conversations in Our Faith Communities?
I'm sorry, say that again.
From Distrust to Trust, Conversations in Our Faith Community and Controversies. It's by two American Baptists, Matt Sturdivant and Tim Bonner, on some suggestions for being willing to trust enough to have dialogue with those with whom we disagree. And I was wondering kind of what you think about that approach as a step toward maybe some future ahead. My thought was when we tried that at Southern, we were taking advantage of for things like the Peace Committee and trying to dialogue.
Well, it depends on how they are led. I don't know that book. I'm glad to hear that title. I think it's a good concept. I have to go back to my old sociology studies of a long time ago, and conflict studies, and any group in which you have basically, I think it was Lee mentioned, authoritarian personalities who have no capacity to be flexible. That won't work. And you have to have a leadership and structure where you can have open dialogue with respect for every other person in the room. And if that's not a ground rule of the conversation, then the more conversation you have, the more divided the group becomes. That's been my experience, at least.
Larry, if I could speak into that, you know, on page 98 of your book, you make reference to the intensities of conflict.
Yes.
And
I quote you.
Yeah, I know. And as you know, I took speed lease 5 and moved it to 7, but it was just a subdividing of his 5. The problem was, and it's what I trained associational directors of missions in all throughout the 80s at Glorieta and Ridgecrest, when you and Bill Treadwell also were involved in that. The problem is that the fundamentalists were always willing to take it one intensity higher than the moderates were. The moderates wanted peace. The fundamentalists wanted to win. And so whoever will take intensity one intensity higher, conflict one intensity higher than the other, is always going to win.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. Larry, when I was at Berea College, we had a social psychologist to come and talk about issues like this. And I recall that she reported when a strong personality goes up against another strong personality to try to resolve an issue, they fail 85% of the time. I don't know where she got her data, but that sounds right, doesn't it?
I could believe that easily. Yeah.
Larry, could I give a whimsical kind of story about women in ministry before we close, kind of thing? It's referenced in your book. In your book, you talk about when Linda Frost was ordained at Westside Baptist Church there in Louisville, and that was after my tenure there. But you also talk about Susan Lockwood Wright. Well, Jerry Allen and I worked with her father at the Home Mission Board. And when she was pastor of Cornell Baptist Church in Chicago, Bill Tanner, the president, was getting all kinds of pressure about, how can you have a staff person who would so mislead his daughter that she thought she could be a pastor? And so, but there was no direct conversation going on between Tanner and Quentin Lockwood, but we could just all feel the heat in the Association of Missions Division until one day Tanner and Quentin Lockwood were on the elevator together, the only ones on the elevator. And Tanner turns to Quentin and says, "Quentin, I heard about your daughter." And Quentin, with his thought, went, "Yeah, well, oh boss, yeah, well, Quentin, shut up. Let me tell you something. When all else fails, you got to support your kids." The elevator door opened up, Tanner walked off, and he never said another word about Susan.
How about that?
Yeah.
That surprises me. You and I think Jerry were involved in trying to get me on the staff at the Home Mission Board, and Tanner was the
director.
He was the one that killed that.
Well, what you can say is, I'm
glad he did, because it wasn't the right move for me.
Well, I was so pleased because that's when I was leaving to come to South Carolina, and that you were going to be the one, you were my mentor, and you were going to be the one who would come and take my place. And Jerry and I did our best to wine and dine you out there at that airport hotel and try to get you to come, but then Tanner messed it up.
Well, the reason is he went before the trustees about it and says, now this guy's real even-handed on the conflict and all. And Bill Sherman spoke up. "What do you mean? He's part of the Gatlinburg game with my brother." That's what killed it. Well, thank you all. This has been a wonderful experience for me, and it's like being back in a family reunion, isn't it?
Amen.
Thank you so much, Larry. We really,
a great book. Thank
you all here, and God's blessing on each. Y'all take good care. Oh, by the way, tell everybody you know what a great book they need to buy.
It is. It's good. Very good.
This is the best Zoom meeting we've had.
Press the place where it says leave, hit that. Say leave,
They leave. Hit the white one.
it's red.
Okay. This one?
No.
Everybody, take care. Thank you, Floyd.